Thank you, dear ones, for your practice. Such a precious gift it is to gather in this way, to turn toward together the wholesomeness of our being here in Sangha. Something I find myself appreciating more and more each day, the preciousness of coming together. Not guaranteed, right? One day to the next. And as this deep sense of impermanence has felt more vivid in my heart as of late, it seems it does bring with it a certain level of urgency, as the Dharma points toward. An urgency to love and to protect life wherever we can, when we are able, when there's capacity. And that sense of responsibility to the whole is very much what inspired the Dharma reflection for today, and this theme around revolutionary love, Mettā in the Metacrisis. And I just want to begin by acknowledging, what I imagine may be already very present in our hearts, just this awareness of the scale and magnitude of what's unfolding in our world right now. And though there are many, familiar dynamics and patterns playing out on the collective, in many ways, it's nonetheless a very unprecedented time on our planet. Even over the long arc of history here on Earth, or at least, as much as that we're able to know about that history. And the grief that can arise in response to this can feel pretty unbearable some days, at least it has in my own body. Across, many regions of the world, there's what's being described as high intensity zones, places where violence and instability is rapidly intensifying, and the number of zones seems to also be growing on the daily, which is very concerning, right? And entire communities are caught in waves of militarization, of extraction, decimation, and just absolute and utter chaos. And I'm thinking about our friends particularly, and our relatives, human and more than human, across the Middle East, the whole of West Asia, and into the African continent, where spanning these territories, genocide has become an ongoing and plural reality. And for those of us here in the so-called United States of America, we also are living within one of those zones of intensity. And this is manifesting in many ways. And to name just a couple, we're seeing this through the targeting and disappearing of our migrant relatives, so-called immigrants, particularly immigrants of color. We're seeing this in the erosion of rights and the escalating legislative hostility and assault toward our trans and gender expansive relatives, creating conditions of inhabitability that has dramatically actually increased the rate in which trans people, particularly trans young people, are dying by suicide. All of which many scholars of genocide are now actually warning, are showing early indicators of genocidal conditions right here on Turtle Island. And we've known that history before. And there's many other widening fractures in the social fabric that weaves us together as a planet, really too many to name in this moment without turning this into a whole talk, into a dissertation. Yet each one of these struggles, so very deserving of our attention, our compassion, and ultimately our liberation work in how we mobilize and engage and respond, this quality of sacred activism. In the broader narrative climate, we sometimes might hear this language about a so-called war on wokeness, these so-called basic acts of care, of solidarity, of protection of vulnerable communities is framed as something to fear, something dangerous. And perhaps there's an iota of truth there because love is, after all, revolutionary. As Assata Shakur, our now ancestor, said, revolution means protecting the people, the plants, the animals, the air, the water. Revolution means saving this planet. Revolution is love. So if we look closely, what is often labeled as the enemy in the projections that shape ideologies of domination is simply human decency, humane values, the seed at the heart of our volition to protect life. And depending on who you are and where you live and the identities you inhabit, these violences are felt very personally and very immediately. And yet, in other senses, this moment is personal for all of us because none of us are actually separate from what is unfolding. And the Dharma illuminates this through the central insight of interdependence, that none of us actually stand outside all conditioned phenomena. And I think for many people, though certainly not everyone, there's also a growing sense that something deeper may be unraveling beneath these colliding events of catastrophe, that the veils that once gave the illusion of stability or order are thinning. That once maybe what appeared solid is actually revealing itself to be far more fragile than many imagined. And if you nerd out at all on systems change, the way that I tend to in my quote unquote spare time, you're probably aware of this concept of Metacrisis that many are using to describe this moment we're living in, this convergence of many crises unfolding simultaneously across the planet. And what's really interesting to me about this concept of the metacrisis is that beneath these crises is a shared pattern that's revealing itself. There are many diagnostics for this, but one that bell hooks actually used to describe this kind of root cause is imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And from the perspective of the Buddha, by way of the core teaching around the wheel of dependent origination, he also helped illuminate the nature of what's often driving these patterns of empire and domination, which is something we could look at as a crisis of perception, a crisis rooted in the distortion that we are somehow separate from one another. And once this perception of separation takes hold, it can become something of a slippery slope into what the Buddha named very clearly as aversion, one of the three poisons of the mind. Aversion, being that impulse to push away what we fear, what we dislike, what we experience as threatening or unpleasant. And, its premise, it depends almost entirely on separative consciousness. That moment the mind believes that the so-called other is truly separate from us. This is when the conditions for ill will can be particularly ripe. And it can gather momentum very quickly, which I imagine all of us here have had the experience of in one way or another, even small in our daily lives. And perhaps we even justify our own behaviors differently than those we immediately place judgment over. Somehow we are more reasonable or righteous or well informed in our separation. But in any case, once the illusion of separation takes hold, the conditions for ill will are already forming. And when aversion takes hold of the heart, our capacity to see clearly quickly becomes threatened. Understanding and empathy is harder to access. Wisdom, becomes more difficult to discern. The mind becomes, in a sense, incarcerated inside its own defensive or even protective structures. And ill will can actually seduce us with a kind of, illusory promise of safety and security, and it can prey on our own wounds as well, drawing us into cycles of grasping at safety. And one of the more tender and challenging aspects of my practice as of late is seeing how deep the illusion of that promise can actually run. I've been sitting honestly with that question, actually, especially as a trans person. Is complete and total safety ever truly possible when it is sought outside of ourselves, outside of that which is not subject to the conditions of this body and this world? In this way, I've been kind of seeing how aversion can function almost like a trickster within the mind. If this person just goes away, then I'll be safe. If this regime just falls, then I'll be safe. Looking for certainty in that which is uncertain, as Ajahn Chah would say, chasing something that actually ultimately can never fully be guaranteed, only ensures the continuation of dukkha, of suffering. The Buddha also, mapped this pattern very carefully, this sankhara, through the central teaching of paticca samuppada, the co-arising of causation. And this, in the first line of the paticca samuppada, avijja paccaya sankhara, with ignorance as condition, formations arise. Ignorance here does not mean, stupidity. That wouldn't be a very compassionate way to understand the many causes and conditions that give rise to ignorance in the in the first place. But instead, we might see this as an invitation to investigate where we may not be seeing clearly, not seeing the impermanent nature of things, not seeing the interdependent nature of life. And, this is a risky business because the mind is quite brilliant, as we know, but also it can become very dangerous when it's not rooted in awareness. And when ignorance is the primary force conditioning formations, the mind can begin to fabricate all kinds of identities and narratives through distorted thinking or delusion. And formations condition consciousness. Consciousness conditions form. And gradually we see entire worlds appear organized around subject and object, self and other, me and mine, good and bad, which probably sounds very familiar, because this is also the dominant worldview operating in much of the world today. A worldview that's shaped by individualism, by extraction, separation, domination. And once that vision, hardens both within our own minds and within the institutions and governance that shape our societies, the doorway for aversion opens very easily into the structural, right? Systemic hatred, systemic fear, systemic erasure. The apartheid mind becoming visible in the very architecture of the world, literally manifested through the maze of dramatic walls that we see today imposed across occupied Palestine, as perhaps one of the starkest illustrations of how far the logic of separation can extend when it becomes embedded within systems of power. So from the perspective of the Dharma, the metacrisis we are living through is not only social or ecological or political. It's also a crisis of how consciousness itself has been patterned, a crisis of the heart-mind. And when we can really begin to see that clearly, and the scale of that patterning and how it's manifested, it really can feel quite overwhelming. So just want to honor that. And the question that often can arise from that place of disenchantment when the veils begin to lift is where do we even begin? What do we actually do? And this is a doorway of exploration of possibilities that I encourage us to not fear engaging, actually, as there's a whole landscape of strategy and collective response to consider. But in my own day-to-day life, especially in these moments when a massive, for example, general strike feels thousands of miles away, I often find myself returning to something I can do, which is practice. And lately, for me, I've been practicing a lot with Mettā. And, I think in many Western contemporary contexts, Mettā can get somewhat of a strange reputation, almost treated as kind of elementary or reduced to a kind of, self-care practice thanks to the industrial wellness complex. But in the classical teachings, Mettā is far more radical. It's a profound training of the heart, this deliberate cultivation of goodwill. Mettā, one of the four Brahma Viharas, the divine abidings of the heart. And one translation of Mettā that I've actually really appreciated is very simple: that which softens the heart. You know, a healing balm for the harsh ways we often relate to ourselves, and the ways those patterns can then be projected outward onto the world, as I was speaking to earlier in the structural, the ways that manifest in the structural. And I have actually found that this practice of Mettā, when brought into difficult experiences, can be very alchemizing, and it's a little awkward and even a little uncomfortable at times. The judging mind can really like to judge, as it does, and may say, you know, this is not for me, this is far too cheesy, or to all the eternal pessimists out there, no shade at all if that is you. And Mettā can, sometimes land very pointless, especially with the world on fire. But over time, like I found with many aspects of the Dharma, when practiced with sincerity and patience, like very magical and mysterious things can unfold, including this tenderizing of the heart. Often, we just notice one day that things are different. We're not so contracted in the presence of difficult experience. There's more capacity suddenly to remain present with sensations coming and going without a whole story needing to be imposed over those sensations. And this, fluidity of the heart-mind is often a signature of awareness rooted in loving kindness. This becomes and can become a way of being, a complete ontological transformation. And from this, way of being, the instinct to see what is difficult and therefore therefore threatening, can also begin to soften. And it's a place, a deeper recognition of our interdependence can emerge from. A force capable of transforming the very ideologies of separative consciousness that shape so much of suffering in the world and in our own hearts. And this doesn't mean throwing out discernment or accepting abuse relationally or within our systems either. I appreciate Prentice Hemphill's perspective on boundaries, which they articulate as the distance in which I can love you and me at the same time. And this is often where I sense the threshold between loving kindness and compassion. How these Brahma Viharas are mutually reinforcing of one another. And there's, many more remarkable qualities of Mettā that the Buddha actually describes quite explicitly in the Anguttara Nikaya, a discourse that many of you may already be familiar with here, sometimes referred to as the Metta Benefit Sutta. And in this discourse, the Buddha lists 11 benefits that arise when loving kindness is cultivated and practiced deeply. He says that one who practices Mettā sleeps easily, wakes easily, does not have bad dreams, is dear to human beings, is dear to non-human beings. The devas protect them. Fire, poison, and weapons do not easily harm them. The mind concentrates quickly. The face becomes serene. One dies unconfused. And if awakening is not yet complete, one is reborn in the Brahma worlds. So there's not time to actually break all these down in detail, which is actually really fascinating, as there are some great stories from the time of the Buddha that illustrate examples of these qualities manifesting. But one I'd like to place, I'm going to go just a little bit over with the talk, if that's hopefully okay, because I just want to place a little time on one of these qualities in particular. Which is metta as a form of protection. And, I'm in many circles right now where people are speaking about protection. How do we protect ourselves in the current political and social climate? And just like the question of what can we even do right now in response to our world, this inquiry of protection also has many layers and no single or right answers. I just want to make that clear. But I do find it very interesting that this discourse points towards metta as a field of goodwill that can disarm hostility before it takes hold. And I've had a very direct experience of this actually some years ago when I was in the Amazon rainforest, actually in South America. I was staying in a small tambo, basically just a very simple hut with little more than, a mosquito net separating me from the rest of the jungle. And one night, a massive centipede entered the tambo. And when I say massive, I mean probably like close to 18 inches long of bright neon colors, like nothing I'd ever seen before, almost like out of a psychedelic fever dream. And it, was moving incredibly fast across the screened walls and, eventually encroached onto the mosquito net. And I remember at that point feeling completely terrified. And the mind immediately went to, like, this is for sure one of those poisonous jungle centipedes, and this is definitely the moment I'm going to die. And that sense of self and other, just completely unhinged in that moment, where it didn't take me long to identify this creature as an existential threat. That I was the most vulnerable one here, and the mind considering even how to harm this beautiful centipede. Telling myself that it would be justified, as self-protection. And then I did remember the teachings on metta from the Anguttara Nikaya discourse, and I began practicing loving kindness, like my life actually depended on it, because it felt like that in that moment. May I be safe. May this being be safe. May I be free from harm. May this being be free from harm. And I sat with that practice for literally hours as this centipede paced every inch of that small space we were inhabiting together. And at some point, the mind just settled into a very deep samadhi, another quality in which metta can bring about this ease of concentration. And at some point during that epic samadhi, the centipede just left the tambo. I don't actually remember the moment it happened. I only remember realizing it was gone. And that, what stayed with me was not just that the centipede left, it was that the whole experience had changed my relationship to the jungle. Because over the several weeks I was there, I was completely initiated by how conditioned my mind had been to experience the unfamiliar as a threat. And in a place like the Amazon where biodiversity is so immense, and there's literally, you're encountering possibly new species, that unfamiliar terrain is, showing up constantly. And this is perhaps one of the miracles of this practice of metta, is that it can really transform separative consciousness, and it can bring us more deeply into relationship with the world, which I do think it's interesting, this little play on words, metta and the Metacrisis, because in a time of Metacrisis, when the scale of suffering is so vast, when the scale of othering so vast, the path is not to harden against, but to train the capacity to be with, right? To soften the conditions that give rise to ill will, to remember our belonging within this sacred web to which we've actually never been separate from. So I think that's plenty. I'll end there. Thank you, friends, for your kind listening. So we've arrived now 8 minutes past the hour. I had hoped to end at the hour. But for anyone who needs to step away, at this point, please feel free to do so. If you haven't, if you need to get going with your day, totally understand. I believe Sumeda might have put some announcements and links already in the chat. Okay, great. For those who would like to, stay connected to any upcoming offerings at SMS,